Um, Thanks also to my previous speakers, Nora and Clotilde, because it was really very enriching and very much complementary to what I have to say. Actually, I will be repeating almost what they said, but maybe packaging it in a different way so that we are in a dialogue, I hope. And I will be addressing not so much the green transition, but rather the challenge that the green transition entails. And I will address in particular the social and environmental inequalities in housing to make this a bit more concrete. But I will also provide an analytical framework to read this phenomena in a way that I think might be relevant for us to understand the dynamic. I will be talking about four issues. The first one is I will try to show you some insights, some data, some about the fact that housing issues are becoming very relevant nowadays in the debate of inequality. Just in the last year, actually in the last month or weeks, a few reports have been published. Clotilde mentioned already one about from the European Foundation in Dublin, but also the OECD and Sciences Po, by the way, published a few weeks ago a report. You might be familiar, but maybe not everybody is familiar with that. And out of this debate, I will try to identify some relevant questions to look for an answer. I won't give you an answer, but I will provide, I hope, a framework which might help us together to give an answer to that. And then I will provide some examples from Vienna as an interesting case, because it has been challenged in a way, housing produces inequalities, etc., etc. So I will show you what Vienna is doing nowadays and how Vienna is also challenged in its model. Okay, let me start. Housing issues are becoming very relevant in the debate about inequalities. So these are the three reports. Have you read any of them? Raise your hand. At least one. Well, yes, you quoted it in your talk, so nobody else read that. Oh, that's quite interesting. So luckily, so the first one is on affordable housing and inadequate housing in Europe by the European Foundation in Dublin for the quality of life and living conditions. The second is by the OECD, Home, Green Home, Policies to Decarbonize Housing. And the third one is greener housing, but affordable. And as you can grasp already from the title, it tries to establish a link between the two phenomena, which is what we are interested in. What these reports show, and in particular this report, it's that there are many different dimensions of inequality, and they are all interrelated to one another. They talk to each other, they are relational. I will be repeating relationality quite often because it's never said enough, I think. So equal opportunities are related to unequal living conditions, to environmental damage, increased inadequate housing, increased healthcare costs, people's health and well-being are affected by bad conditions, housing insecurity, etc., etc. And I will show you some of the results of these studies. The European Foundation analyzed EUSILC data, so it's available to everybody, but I think they packaged it in a nice way, and I will give you a few glimpses of the results. Usually to my students, I tell never do a slide like that because everybody won't read it and it's extremely boring. So I won't do it. I will try to highlight. So you will get the slides, I guess. So you will read all of that. But I will highlight a few of them. So focusing your attention a bit. So I hope that's a bit better. One of the results is in the past decade, home ownership in the EU has decreased. Surprise. Driven by a drop in home ownership among young people. So what do you think this means? Why is it the case? What are the implications of that? So, yes, insecurity, precariousness, things like that. And indeed, um, the age at which at least 50% of people in the EU were living outside the parental home increased from 26 to 28. That means people or young people live at home for longer periods of time. And this is particularly true in some countries more than others. I heard that there were several Italians around here in the room. Raise your hand. Okay. Well, Italy, it's a very famous case for young people living until the age of 34 in their parental home, but also other South European countries, so Spain, Greece, Croatia, actually, and Belgium, surprisingly, Ireland as well, Cyprus, etc. So that's, I think, one interesting result because it says that inadequate housing is not evenly distributed across generations. And it requires specific preconditions in order to access housing. Another important result out of that, and it has been already addressed by Nora and others, even yesterday, the share of income spent on housing decreased for homeowners, but it increased for tenants. And it increased from 28 to 31% on average in the European Union. That means that this includes also um, rural areas where this share is extremely low. So you can imagine how it will be in cities. And I will show you some data on cities comparing Vienna with other major cities in Europe. This means, so who are these people? These are the people who are spending at least 40% of their income on housing. And 60% of this 31% report having difficulties in making ends meet. So housing is increasingly relevant for the quality of life of people. So these are some of the results of this analysis. The OECD report shows that housing emissions, CO2 emissions in tons, are almost 1/3 of the total emissions. It depends on residential, direct or indirect, or in the building and construction, but it's quite a relevant share. So it's relevant also for us if we want a green, just transition to address this issue. It's 29% in OECD countries, but globally it's 38%. So which is quite a relevant share. Of course, emissions and energy consumption in the residential sector are not evenly distributed. I also don't like this kind of guide. It's too much information. So I highlight just the two extremes. So in the US, the tons per capita are much higher than in Norway. What do the Norwegians do? Their life is nice, but they export. They export. So offshoring is also an issue in the green transition. So again, some policy implications that the OECD highlighted. Never do this, so I highlight again some important elements. They suggest there are various market imperfections, surprise, surprise, that are specific to the housing sector, and they call for going beyond carbon pricing. So carbon pricing is the main solution, but they might need something else because it's not enough. And what do we need? We need well-coordinated mix of policies. Regulatory measures are important complements to carbon pricing. That's interesting because what we have heard in the last few days was criticizing regulatory bodies like the state and supranational bodies like the European Union. So we have to make distinctions. And as a social scientist, I always say, but it depends. And it depends how things are done. So we should not blame the state or the European Union, but we should blame what they do, why, how, through people that are in power. And someone voted for these people. We should be aware of that. So what does it mean to have a well-coordinated mix of policies? For instance, these policies should adjust rent setting rules to allow both landlords and tenants to benefit from energy savings, avoiding offloading the costs of retrofitting onto tenants. And this is a typical redistributional issues of costs. So it's not so relevant to retrofit, but who pays for that? You're probably all familiar with Josef Schumpeter. Who knows Schumpeter? Okay, good, very good. Schumpeter is an economist who is probably not the most progressive one, but he said, if you want really to know how things go, follow the money, beyond any ideology. And actually following the money, it will be what we will be doing also in my talk. Another important statement by the OECD, which is not the most progressive organizations, even though there are very good people there as well. Compensatory measures can be used to offset adverse effects on vulnerable social groups. The social housing sector can play a leading role. That's fantastic. Building new and retrofitting existing social housing units according to high environmental standards would directly contribute to housing decarbonization and reduce the risk of energy poverty, which is what we all want, of course. But as you probably know, social housing is not on the highest priority, and building new social housing estates is quite low in the policy agenda. But we will see how things are differently played out in different countries and in different cities. So finally, this last report by Sciences Po. And this report addresses actually what we are interested in, the complex relationship between environmental policies in the building sector and access to affordability. And these policies include, for instance, urban densification, eco-retrofitting of the existing housing stock, and also energy efficient standards for new buildings, which are quite banal policies, but they are played out differently in different contexts. So the contextual dimension is one of the key analytical elements we should consider. It's not a container, something which takes place somewhere, but it's actively contributing to shape the phenomena we are investigating. But I will come back on the analytical model later on. So probably you are all aware of this picture about densification, the superblocks. It's quite famous, and it's often considered one of the best strategies for achieving sustainability goals. Why? Because proximity, it's more efficient land use, transportation, mobility, it's less costly, it's less polluting, urban functions are concentrated, so are less costly, etc., etc. So it's a good example of sustainability goals to be reached in this way. Another element is the ecological retrofitting. We have heard it yesterday about energy, poverty, and indeed, the way in which this retrofitting is taking place is, of course, key. And here is a nice example from an Interreg project in Croatia, where low-income people and elderly from the lower income group had their house retrofitted, and actually the costs of the retrofitting was not offloaded on them. They paid just 0.07 cent euro per square meter in increase because of a retrofit. So the advantages were much, much higher. I don't need to explain to you what is retrofitting, I guess. So what are the relevant questions to address and to find an answer? There are little so far in the literature empirical cases that analyze the ecological transitions and the redistributive effect of the cost, including the social risks and the social policies aimed at counteracting them. Only very recently, there was a call in the European Horizon project that for the first time addressed this issue. And actually, NORA is part of a consortium that won of the bids, and probably in January we will start a large Horizon project. Actually, Sciences Po is there as well with Marco Kremarski. We will start a project trying to combine these two perspectives. But what we are interested in is actually not so much the single policy, but we are interested at a higher level of abstraction. What are the synergies and the criticalities of this relationship? How the environmental policy affect the social conditions, and how are we able to intervene with some institutional solutions, social policies, or whatever kind of policies to change the balance in a more equal direction. And what contextual factors play an important role in shaping this relationship? So is it the same when we have a demographic situation where migration is challenging a city, where the migration background of the inhabitants of a city is 50%, for instance, or almost no migrants, or elderly people, or young people? So with all this, or is it an economically thriving context or it's a backward context where economy is declining and the cities are shrinking. All these elements are relevant to be considered in the equation in understanding the impact of this kind of measures. And actually, this is never done or very rarely. So I guess in our project, we will try to put this into perspective. So we have environmental targets, as I said, the reduction of CO2 emissions. We have a reduction of energy consumption on our priority agenda and the shift to renewable energy, which are all wonderful tasks. We have also social targets. Affordable housing for all, that's fantastic. Reduction of energy poverty and diversity in residents, so the avoiding the concentration and segregation of specific groups in specific areas in cities. Unfortunately, these policies are not, the policies addressing these targets are never in a dialogue. And that's a problem. Why it is a problem? Because there might be perverse effects of environmental policies. And these perverse effects are, for instance, rebound effects, so increased energy consumption despite retrofitting, but also gentrification. Are you all familiar with the term of gentrification? I guess it's common language in the meantime. But there is also green gentrification. Our colleague Isabel Angelovsky in Barcelona is one of the main scholars in that. And actually, when you are refurbishing a neighborhood or requalifying specific areas with greening areas, suddenly middle and middle upper classes are coming in and the poor people are pushed out of this neighborhood. And actually, there is an increasing segregation going on. This can be avoided, of course, but the way in which avoiding this makes, of course, a difference and can be very contextual and very different in different contexts. Okay, so we saw that. And actually, also the way in which the costs through tax models is distributed according within the population makes also a big difference. And actually, the devil is in the detail. So we need to enter into the technicalities to understand that. We cannot just state the principles, oh, we want affordable housing for all. Of course, who doesn't want it? We want a green transition. Who doesn't want it? The problem is how this takes place. Who pays for that? How are the costs redistributed? Has everybody access to it? So the details. And these details are really very relevant. So what do we want? We want actually low carbon inclusive housing. How do we achieve that? We achieve that in putting these two into relation, in a balance, in a dialogue, and they should feed each other. Sure, we should be aware of a potential perverse effect of environmental issues. We have heard this morning a lot of examples of how this is not the case, and we should balance that with social targets. Actually, the environmental targets are coming in relatively late. The social targets were established already since a long time. The development of a welfare state, it's more than 100 years over now. And the environmental targets are now putting this situation a bit in a difficult situation, let's say. So what are the intersecting and emerging issues out of these reports? Densification might increase green gentrification and segregation. Retrofitting might decrease access and affordability. And commodification and financialization of housing increases inequality. We haven't mentioned the term commodification, but I guess you're all familiar with that. Commodification is being exposed to the market, being exposed to the market mechanisms. And how do markets work? They work through prices. They work through supply and demand. And the more I offer, the less it costs. The less I offer, the more it costs, or the more I'm available to pay. So it's this kind of mechanisms. And we are now in a trend, in a neoliberalizing trend, where the commodification of housing is taking place more and more, and which is, of course, a problem. But in synthesis, the reports tell us, all three actually, that sustainability can be achieved. It can be achieved, but it can be achieved only if we grasp the relationality of the issues at stake and complement green with social measures, which is, of course, quite a challenging task. And I will try to provide you with an analytical framework. I'm not a housing expert. This is an outing. And I'm also not a sustainability expert. So I don't know what I'm doing here, actually. Uh, Actually, I'm learning a lot from you, so I'm very thankful for that. Actually, I have to admit, when I wrote my master thesis a lot of decades ago, in the late 80s, uh, I wrote it about the theoretical foundation of ecological theories. So Gregory Bates and Jakob von Uexküll, if there are Germans here, they might know him, and others. And when I entered my PhD, I thought I have a wonderful project. I want to address the social and environmental costs of economic success. And in the end of the 80s, nobody was relating these two elements together. So I didn't have theories, empirical results to rely on, etc. So I ended up working on social issues, on social justice. But now I'm getting back into my love of first sight in my post-adolescent years. So I will try to adopt a social policy perspective to the ecological transition. And I'm an urban sociologist actually, who are interested in social policies as well. So I'm interested in the territorial dimension of social policy, as you kindly reminded. So I will try to frame my approach for a European city perspective. I'm not talking about cities around the world. It would be too complicated for me. I will give a European city perspective, providing some empirical examples in highlighting the relationship between social and environmental justice. Actually, I've been involved in a lot of projects on these issues, so I have something to share with you. And I'm coming now to my third point. And I will try to highlight the analytical dimensions because I think analytical frameworks are important to understand phenomena. We should not stay in our ivory tower. We should confront ourselves. And I very much appreciated that the speakers were not all academics. I also like to do a lot of research and being engaged with people, not just as interviewees, but also people who do stuff. And we have projects with Caritas and other NGOs working precisely on these issues. But anyway, analytical frameworks are relevant, and I will try to make a point with that. So usually, European cities have been associated with social cohesion, quality of life, relatively low poverty rates, economic competitiveness, in particularly after the economic boom after the Second World War. And how was this possible? This was possible for a mix of different dimensions. Recognition, it was important to recognize rights, civil rights usually, acknowledging identities and diversity, which was very important. And this how? Through democratic inclusion, representation, political rights, democracy, which was not enough. We needed also another part, another dimension, and actually it was redistribution, it was social rights, it was equity. And actually it's with this synergy out of these three dimensions which contributed to a high level of social justice and specific forms of citizenship in European cities. Of course, I'm not 100% stupid, and I'm aware that there is a colonial past and a colonial legacy. So Europe exploited someone to get resources to build up the wealth, partly, not only, but also. And there is also an offshoring of costs. So we might keep wealthy and clean, offshoring and exporting our waste somewhere, maybe to Africa, with big ships loaded with toxic waste, etc., etc. So these are issues which would require a lot of thought and analysis, and I would touch about that, but I would like to put it there as a relevant point of discussion. So probably this was Nancy Fraser's analytical framework. Those of you coming from the social sciences probably are aware that there is not very much difference from what T.H. Marshall said quite some time ago, which is not so different what Karl Polanyi said. From another perspective, he was an anthropologist from Hungary, actually, who lived also in Vienna. Actually, at that time, it was all one country, an empire. But he flew because it was not so comfortable to live there anywhere. And also for the Italians, Maurizio Ferrera, who is a political scientist working on social policy. But all these dimensions, as you can see, probably they overlap. We have philosophers, we have political scientists, we have social policy experts, we have anthropologists, but all are working on this kind of thing. And these are more or less overlapping frameworks and all share one important element. What is this element? What do you think is here? Quick reactions, otherwise, come on. Yes, that's the big thing. More specific? Well, partly related to that, yes. Well, but in a way, but how do you achieve it? Yes, partly. So, and how do you produce the welfare state? Through politics. So they share the strong influence of public institutions, not just urban planning, but also national policies and the welfare state, which brought about the fact that comparatively to other countries and other parts of the world, lower levels of social spatial inequalities. And the scholars were considering these elements as building blocks of what they identified as the European city as a model for social justice. But did this model really existed? Is Palermo the same as Stockholm or Paris the same as Budapest or Ljubljana? Most probably not. But despite the many different analytic approaches, they all share, most scholars share, the fact that it is the civitas which makes a difference, the political element, the political dimension, which is also what helps us differentiating policies in Palermo, or I'm sorry for the Italians here, and policies in Sweden have different reference to a distribution to civil and political rights. Maybe they share some of these elements, so civil and political might be similar, but probably the distribution is less common. So welfare state intervention and activism of local authorities in meeting populations' social needs is what has been produced after the Second World War. However, and I'm sorry for that, European cities are now under pressure. And they are under pressure because there are a lot of transformations going on. There are social demographic transformations, there are post-industrial transitions, there is the green transition, there is welfare rescaling. And the magnitudes of these changes, in particular after the 70s, and their impact is not uniformly distributed across Europe. We're talking about Europe and nation states, but actually there are differentiation processes going on. And there are differentiation processes are going on both within Europe, but also within countries, among cities. And that's an important dynamic which is taking place. And we should try to understand how this affects one size fits all policies which are put forward by the European Union, but also by some nation states. How do we consider context sensitivity as a key element to understand if a policy might be successful or not? This is absolutely crucial. If you know Peter Rossi was someone who was in evaluation. And in evaluation studies, he said, measures cannot be analyzed out of context. It's the measure plus the context which produces the output. So if the same measure is applied in different contexts, the output will be different. And we have to be aware of that, and that's very important. So what is missing here in this kind of analytical framework. We have recognition, we have representation, and we have redistribution. What is missing is the environment, actually, and which is not so much of a container, but it's something which creates boundaries, which makes sense of how the different dimensions work. And actually, the social, the redistribution of costs use the environment very often to offload social tensions. How do we offload social tensions? By economic growth, so that the cake grows and we distribute more to more people. And this is, of course, a problem, because as soon as we put the boundaries there, we are not able to redistribute more, and the redistributional conflicts might emerge even stronger than before. And this is a key element. And the environmental policies are putting this element of contradiction at the forefront. And that's really something we need to address in our analytical frameworks, but also in our empirical research. So, what analytical tools do we need to understand this dynamic, this relation between these dimensions? Here, I have been working lately with some colleagues on the following. I try to combine some knowledge in different fields and in many years of research, trying to understand why difference emerges in different contexts. And here I found that we need to have a relatively abstract analytical toolbox which considers jurisdictions. Jurisdictions are absolutely crucial. What are jurisdictions? Jurisdictions are lines that are drawn, and within these borders, something can happen. People can have rights, people might not have rights. You might redistribute resources within these boundaries, etc. Most of you are from the European Union, I guess. Not all, but maybe I would say 85% probably. Well, when European citizenship have been developed, you got all a European passport. This gives you specific rights. You know, one of the biggest advantages of the European Union, well, you all know now blame the European Union, but there is also some positive elements which affects you and your life careers worldwide. I always ask my students, nobody understands that. And I'm surprised because this was one of the biggest path disrupting life change opportunities for younger people, for still for me, but for younger people even more. Yeah? Yes, but it's not enough. There is one element which is even more important. This is a precondition. So you have to move, be able to move. But partly you were able to move before as well. But not many people moved because it was not worth moving. Why? Pensions, for instance. You were working in one country, you were paying contributions, you were moving to another country, you were losing all of that. The portability of social rights. It's one of the biggest revolutions ever. You're working 5 years here, 5 years there, 5 years there, within Europe. You are able to take all your bits and pieces. So you don't have to fulfill the requirements of paying contributions 20 years in one country. You can pay 5 years here, 5 years there, 5 years there, and then you will get the pension. Of course, you will get a small pension from where you paid for 5 years, etc., but you will get it. This is a big revolution, a paradigmatic revolution. So jurisdictions are important, and also policies are important. So measures, instruments. Friends and colleagues from Sciences Po developed the whole governing through policy instruments as an approach, and it's actually important. Why? Because policies are not just policies. They reflect regulatory principles, and these regulatory principles inform, shape the policy. What do they shape? They shape who is paying, who is accessing this policy, how are the costs redistributed, equally, not equally, etc., etc. So the design, the policy design is absolutely crucial. And these two, the jurisdiction and the policies, are somehow an institutional perspective on the project, on the process. And of course, it's a very relevant. I'm a statalist. I say it very bluntly. I believe that the state is very important. Uh, I will try to qualify also my definition, but I think it was one of the biggest examples of how we are able to achieve great equality. And if you look in Europe, where is greatest equality achieved? Where the state intervenes more. Inequalities are the least in the Nordic countries, where the state redistributes more than 1/3 of the wealth produced within the population. So we should be careful in blaming the state too much. It's the way in which the state is used, the way in which laws are set, the way in which the political game is taking place that makes the difference, not the state per se. So politics plays a very important role. The way in which the actors interact, blame each other, enter in a conflict, etc., etc. And there is the context, which is social demographic, socioeconomic, environmental, etc. And it's the interaction of these four dimensions which produces specific outcomes, which I think are very relevant. And politics, what does politics do? Politics is using these elements in the political game, is using jurisdictions, it's using policies and measures to intervene, and it's trying to address contextual problems, contextual emerging issues, contextual emerging risks. If in 2015 in Vienna, where were trains of people coming, migrants, refugees, asking for refuge, etc., and politics had to reply. It replies in different ways, in some contexts well, in some other contexts less well, but politics has to use jurisdictions, policies, and facing contextual issues. What we should acknowledge is the relationality of these elements, which is very, very important. And also in public administrations, I don't know, is someone of you working in a public administration? One person is working, two, three, okay. Well, probably you are aware of silo thinking. What one person is doing in one part of administration, the other part doesn't want know. And if they know, they don't want to talk to the others because they have vertical accountabilities. The minister, the councillor, whatever. Start to talking, it's already a big revolution within the same municipality. So acknowledging relationality, labor market policies, do they have something to do with green policies? Yes, a lot, but they should talk to each other because requalification measures can be going in the direction of requalifying people for green jobs, etc. Okay, so the relationality of the analytical dimensions is very important, and they allow us to understand what? How urban, social, and environmental policies are embedded in complex multi-level governance arrangements, how they get structured. So history is very important. Yesterday we saw it. And how specific outputs are produced. But we are able to understand this only if we put this four analytical dimension in relation to one another. So without considering the context, without considering sovereignty boundaries, without considering policy design, we are not able to grasp the full picture. One specification to that analytical model is subsidiarity. I haven't heard this word these days, which is quite surprising. I hope everybody knows what subsidiarity is. Actually, it became quite a buzzword, and the European Union is based on subsidiarity. It's an article of the European Treaty, which was a political outcome, of course, in the negotiation of should we build the union? Yes, but the nation state doesn't give up sovereignty. It gives up only a bit of sovereignty. But anyway, it's a very important element. Everybody is in favor of subsidiarity, the far right and the far left. The ones who want participation of the grassroots, but also the ones we want to do it as we want, and the market should go forward. Of course, what is subsidiarity? That's a key issue. I leave that to you, so you can Google in Wikipedia what subsidiarity is. You can read the article of the treaty if you want. But usually, in a nutshell, it says you as a European Union, or you as the state, or you as the region, or you as the city, or you as the family should not do what the individual is able to do by itself. If the individual is not able, then it's a family. If the family is not able, then it's the municipality or the district. And the municipality is not able, it's the region. If the region is not able, it's the nation state. If the nation state should be the European Union, United Nations, I don't know, whatever. It's complex, subsidiarity, and also multi-level governance is complex. And it's a form of bordering, because some cities have specific powers, some states are central states. France is a very good example of a central state, of course, but Germany is an example of federal state. Austria is also a federal state, but is more centralistic than Germany. I was surprised how centralistic is actually Austria. And some countries like Italy is very centralistic. They had a devolution movement at some point, but now it seems to be over, at least partly. But there are some resurgent elements. And actually, multi-level governance means that we have horizontal and vertical actors who are interacting in very complex ways. You have public actors at federal, at regional, at local level, but you have also stakeholders. Fair is not a local actor, it's a supranational actor. You have cooperatives which joined in consortia, which are acting at national level, but they also operate at very local level. So all these elements are complex to disentangle, but we need to disentangle if you want to understand these relations, the relationality behind that, because it's out of this relationality that specific outputs are produced. And there are, of course, different multi-level governance arrangements. You can have subsidiarity, which is very strongly publicly funded. That means NGOs are powerful. You know how many employees have Caritas in Vienna? Employees regularly contributing, paying people. Yes. 105,000 employees. Not bad. 5,000 employees in a city, not the whole of Austria, just in Vienna. And it's an NGO. Well, it's one of the largest employers in the city also. The city is the largest employer. In Vienna, you have 60,000 employees, which is not bad. It's almost a medium-sized European town. So you can imagine how Vienna is able to intervene by just hiring the people. So you have different arrangements of multi-level governance. You can devolve responsibilities to social actors like NGOs, but you can also finance them. So when you finance them, you have active subsidiarity. You have a subsidiarity which you offload the responsibility to specific actors, but you provide them with resources to face this responsibility. And that's, of course, very different from a context where you offload responsibilities to social actors and you don't provide the resources, which is a passive form of subsidiarity. A good example of passive subsidiarity is Italy. I'm sorry for the Italian colleagues here, but they were probably are aware of that. I usually make an example of passive subsidiarity, family allowances. So is having children a private issue or a social issue? It's very private, of course, because it's you making the child, but also it's a very social issue because it's a whole ecosystem of dimensions which is about schooling, infrastructure, services, whatever. Who is bearing the costs of having a child? Is it just the family? Passive subsidiarity. You have a child, you do it by yourself. Or is it society? So providing crash, 0 for free to 3 years old access for free? Or do you have to pay 500 euros per month to have your small kid so that you can work. So you can work to pay the crash. So it's very different, but we have to go into details to understand what kind of localism is there. And I'm coming now to my final point. Vienna is an interesting case. Vienna is interesting for many different reasons. One reason is Vienna conflates the regional and the municipal level. So it's also a Bundesland, which means in a federal system, it has a lot of regulatory capacities. It can impose taxes on specific issues, so raise money by itself, not just redistributed from the national or federal level, which gives Vienna a certain degree of autonomy in relation to other cities which are not able to raise taxes, which are not able to regulate specific fields. And we will see what kind of impact this has. And now I'm coming to the housing market, and I will try to go down from the national or federal to the local. So the Austria's housing market looks like that. Social housing, 23% in Austria, which is not bad at the national level. Private rental is 19%. Home ownership is the main issue. Price regulated 32%, market price unregulated 59%. So that's the Austrian housing model. But out of the social housing, you have also limited profit housing associations, which are a very interesting solution. And I will elaborate on that because I think it's one of the most innovative ways in which Vienna is using a national federal law in specific ways to counteract specific types of perverse effects which might emerge in both environmental and social issues. So the never show like that. It's so Germany and Austria are here, where home ownership compared to Romania is much less, and it's one of the lowest in Europe, but still it's increasing. But Germany, I think Nora said that this morning, Germany and Austria, I add Austria, um, are characterized by rental housing markets rather than home ownership, which is very relevant in our situation. And this is Vienna. In Vienna, you have social housing, 43%. No other countries has such a high figure in Europe. 43% is quite a lot, I can assure you. And this 43% is divided in 21% of municipal housing. What does municipal housing mean? It means that the city owns the housing. It belongs to the city. And 22% for limited profit housing associations, which I will come back later. So price regulated is 65%. So almost 2/3 of the housing market in Vienna is price regulated, which means the city is able to intervene substantially in capping the price increase for housing, which is, of course, fantastic. As you see, the private housing, private rental is also regulated. That's very interesting. Only 11% is exposed to market mechanisms. That's not much, I would say, compared to other countries. And it has a lot of social and environmental implications, as I will hope to show you. The fact that we have ownership and market price doesn't mean that selling or buying a flat is unregulated. It's highly regulated. And that's very interesting. Why it's interesting? Because speculation on housing is much more difficult in Austria. So buying and selling on the housing market, it's not something that you do. Why? Because transactions costs are relatively high. So before buying, you think twice. And once you have it, you don't go for speculation on the market. this is a very important element because it's very highly regulated, Austria, whatever is regulated. Now, I think someone asked about short-term rentals, about the Portuguese example. Someone was mentioning Airbnb. Well, Vienna is now elaborating a regulation that housing cannot be on short-term rental more than 90 days per year. So which will regulate quite substantially this driver of prices, which are very relevant in some cities. Okay, so just to give you some ideas what 43% means or what 22% means, it means that so this is principal residents, 920,000 in Vienna, 210,000 are owned by the municipality. So the municipality has more than 220,000 flats owned. Limited profit housing own another 182%, 85%, and privately owned, regulated are another 200%, 200,000. So all in all, it's almost 600,000 flats that are highly regulated in defining access criteria, the level of rents, which are the most important element in terms of accessibility, affordability, etc. So that's something very important, and it has a long history. As you can see here, erbaut von der Gemeinde Wien in den Jahren 24-25 aus den Mitteln der Wohnbausteuer. What does it mean? It means that this social housing estate has been built in 1924. During the period of Red Vienna. Probably you have heard about Red Vienna. Anybody heard about Red Vienna? Well, some. No, not many. You have turned around your head. It's just 3 or 4. You know? So, but anyway, Red Vienna is quite important because it all started in the early 20s. Actually, Red Vienna is in the period between 1919 and 1934, before the Anschluss, before the Nazi came. And it was a very left-wing government, which was really a lot of ideas, a lot of social innovations, a lot of, so it was a cultural, economic, social project which has its legacies up to now. So up to now, we have the path dependency of Red Vienna. They never, and that's an important element, sold out the housing stock. Like Berlin, like any other big city in Europe where the housing stock has been sold out. So they built within 10 years more than 65 municipal flats in 350 estates, housing a few 100,000 people which were in housing distress. That's, of course, a very relevant project. I don't know if you know this building. It's a very famous, it's called the Karl Marx Hof. Apparently, it's the longest single building with more than 1,300 flats and 5 people living in it. And it's the longest private residential building in the world, apparently. Interesting, but it's interesting not so much because it's so big, also because it's actually a super block in its infancy somehow, but it's also the social project behind it. There were kindergarten, libraries, washing areas in common spaces, fitness rooms. There were even cleaning people going to clean the flats of the workers, so to relieve the workers of the burden of cleaning their own flat. Can you imagine that? I think it's inconceivable now, but it was like that. There is a nice museum within that. You have been in the Wasch Salon, and the whole history is explained. It's really very fascinating. I won't enter into the details of this complex graph. It's the timeline about what happened in different moments in time. What I would like to say, Austria joined the European Union in 95. And by joining the European Union in 95, it accepted also competition law. Competition laws was important. So when the public was going to bid something, had to be bidding for competition. And here came one of the biggest innovations, I think, in Vienna. And I will talk about this innovation later on. But the interesting element of social housing in Vienna is that it is not concentrated in the peripheries. You have the social housing estate all over the city. Even in the most posh neighborhoods, so the 13th district, the 1st district, the 7th, the 8th, the 9th, you have social housing everywhere. You have a 5 million villa and social housing right beside, which is fascinating because you have social mix and relatively low segregation levels at spatially, like this graph shows. Of course, you have conflicts at multi-level governance. At the national level, very often the Conservative People's Party is in power, and their model is a model of home ownership. And home ownership is, of course, increasing inequalities. And they try to deregulate the housing market. Given the fact, however, that Vienna is also a Bundesland, it's able to counteract these tendencies by providing some additional measures which somehow help mitigating the negative effects of privatization. Oh, no, sorry. No. Ah, it's going in the wrong direction. Sorry. I had a quiz for you. And the quiz is how much do you think is the income threshold for a single person income net per month to enter social housing? You can think while I'm trying to find the slide. Huh? He says relatively high. How much is relatively high for you in terms of euros net per month? How much? 700? Okay, right. Where are you from? Okay, 700, 2,000? You said 4,000? I don't know. How much are you earning per month net? So I'm going to find that. So we have quite a big range between 700 and 4,000. And I have to say that your friend was closest. So the net income per month per person is 3,810, which is more than a single full professor in Italy gets per month. So, and I have actually some colleagues in Vienna who are living in social housing. They earn more than 3,800, but they accessed it when they were earning less. And income is not checked after years. So the people living for long periods of time. That's very interesting, of course. Why is this interesting? Because social housing is not targeted to the poorest, to the lowest incomes. It's targeted to a large middle class, fostering the social mix. So living in social housing, it's not stigmatizing. For a 50 square meter flat, even in central district, you pay, how much do you guess you pay for per square meter? You seem to be well informed, huh? He is. You pay €6.80 per square meter, supply utilities included. So if it would be 100 square meters, it would be €680. If you compare it to most other big cities in Europe, I think it's rather low. And look, a family of 4 people, 100,000 net income, net. So after tax. I might a bit biased. I lived most of my life in Italy. So coming to Austria and looking into these figures, it's impossible. How is it possible? No? So it's really, but my Austrian colleagues, so the people living in Vienna who were born in Vienna, say, Viennese, it's neoliberalizing. Gentrification is everywhere. Yes. How can you say that? They are right. In relative terms, there has been a neoliberalization going on, but also gentrification. You have no evictions. The evictions control law is very strict. So before you evict some person, it has really to be, it's an exception. So it's really a very complex situation. Vienna has been challenged by many contextual elements. In the last 20, 30 years, it grew in population, more than 400,000 people coming in. Together with London and Stockholm, the city which had the most increase in population. And of course, it had to build stuff. Also, the changing labor market structure, and there is a slight tendencies towards polarization, and the middle classes are slightly squeezing, but it's nothing compared to other cities. In order to face this increase of population, and in order to change the way in which competition law forces you to intervene in the housing market, they developed this limited profit housing associations and developers competitions. And this is something I already mentioned that several times, which impressed me quite a lot. Usually when you have a competition and you open a call for and people are bidding, one of the criteria is the lowest price. But they had a paradigm shift. They said, it's not the lowest price. We fix the price. The price is €7.50 per square meter. You, bidding, have to offer the highest quality. And we will select out of all the projects that you will supply, the ones with the highest quality provided. I think this is a paradigm change. And I will show you examples that you will, at €7.50 per square meter rent, so 100 square meter flat, €750. 1996, car-free complex. 2006, experimenting with woods. When I showed this picture to some of my students in Italy, middle upper classes. No, everybody. This will be ready next year, 180 flats in the 10th district. And this 180 flats, bees hotels and urban gardening. So strongly environmentally green everywhere, fantastic. There are people coming to Vienna visiting this project. So if you want to come, just let me know. I will organize something. Maybe you should organize an excursion. It's really fascinating. So what characterizes this type of housing solutions? So it's 185,000 flats. It's not a small proportion of the housing stock in Vienna. Subsidized construction, so publicly funded. No corporate income tax, so it costs less, 25% less. They have to provide common spaces. And these common spaces are co-working spaces, a common kitchen. A common kitchen doesn't mean that you don't have a kitchen in your flat. You have a kitchen in your flat, but on top of that, you have a fully furnished kitchen available to everybody. And it's not with the worst appliances, it's with high-level appliances. Club rooms, sauna, library, guest rooms. So if you have guests coming, you can rent them a few rooms in the common rooms of this flat. 7.6 euro per square meter per month, while in the municipality it's €6.80. And they have high environmental standards. So district heating in most cases, totally retrofitted and very well. So this is the kind of, let's say, green transition solution for newly built housing in Vienna. Of course, it's not everything like that. What are the downsides of this type of housing? There are also some downsides. One is the down payment that not everybody is able to afford. So in order to access this kind of housing, you have to pay 500 euro per square meter if you want to enter. And this is there. You have to pay it once. And not everybody is able to afford. For 100 square meters, it's 50,000 euros, which is not much because you can take up a loan or mortgage, but people who are in economic discomfort might not be able to afford that. And they are slightly more expensive than the municipal social housing. But there are also other housing options. So it's not just limited profit housing associations. It's not just social housing from the municipality. It's also cooperatives. I don't know if you have heard about Alt-Erla. Has anybody heard about Alt-Erla? Alt-Erla is a Genossenschaftswohnung. Maybe you have heard about that. There has been a movie recently coming out this year. Actually, this year has become a housing focus movie. The OECD, European Foundations. So this is the social housing. Not social housing, Genossenschaftshousing, but still with very affordable rents. And this is how it looks like. More than 3,000 apartments, 11,000 residents, very green health centers, kindergartens, schools, daycare centers, public libraries, gyms, solars, etc., etc. Leisure clubs, swimming pools on rooftops, etc. So, in comparative terms, this situation is not too bad, and there are some elements which I would like to highlight. Here, Vienna is compared with Berlin, with Hamburg, London, and Paris. And actually, Vienna shows a relatively stable tenure in the housing market. That's very important, the stability. And actually, it increased from the 90s to the 2020s from 40% to 43%. While in most other countries, with the exception of Paris, it decreased substantially. Look how it decreased in Berlin. In Berlin, it was 1/3 of a housing estates, and it became just 10%. And that's why the referendum in Berlin, that's why a lot of demonstration and strikes about the crazy situation which developed in Berlin in the last decades. But also Hamburg. Hamburg was a very social city, ruled by the SPD, with a very large housing stock which has been sold out. And selling out the housing stock, of course, makes you losing control. So the public body is losing control. And by losing control, you can regulate, of course, but it's not enough. London has quite a high share, but still. And look how much is private market regulated. In Vienna, it's very, very little. It's 4% of a housing stock. So 4% of a housing stock is exposed to market forces. All the rest is either home ownership, but home ownership is very low. It's just 11%. All the rest is extremely regulated. Look at London. London ownership is extremely high. And now, one of the indicators we were mentioning before is what is the share of a population who pays more than 40%, or what is the share of a population which pays less than 40% of the income, or who pay more than 40%. You can read it either way. So guess who are the winners and losers? It's very easy. It's too easy. Come on. You know it too well, so don't answer. He's spoiling the quiz. Come on. Yes. Which city has the lowest share of people who pay more than 40% of their income on housing? Yeah. And which is the city where you pay most? Okay. But the difference, the ratio, oh, sorry. It's so in Vienna, only 18% of the population of the residents pays more than 40% of their income on housing, while in London it's 62%. So more than 3 times more. That's a big difference in terms of social equality, in terms of whatever, accessibility, rights, etc. It has implications on everything, the quality of life. Probably you have heard that in the last 10 years, almost in a row, Vienna has been voted as the most livable city in the world. I don't believe very much these kind of rankings, but it's surprising that it won all the time. And it's not just the social housing, actually, because these surveys were done with expats. It's the public infrastructure. And in Vienna, the public infrastructure is the public infrastructure. It's energy, it's water, it's transportation. Everything is public. Insurance. Everything is owned, or the city has shares, majority shares in public companies. And this allows to intervene in the social fabric substantially, providing affordability, providing equal access, providing a solidary way of, a relatively inclusive way of that. I guess you perceive that I'm very supportive of this kind of measures, and my Viennese colleague tried, no, you are biased, you are coming from elsewhere. Also in Vienna, things change, of course. There are trends that are, and there are groups of people who are more excluded than others. Newcomers, for instance, migrants, refugees have it, it's more difficult for them. But still. Okay, what about densification and retrofitting in Vienna to see how the greening measures are played out? Well, densification, we have seen the limited profit housing associations are a particular way of solving the problem of increased population, not only in brownfields, but also in greenfields. I don't know if you have heard about Seestadt Aspern. It was one of the biggest real estate housing projects in Europe. They built out in the middle of nowhere a small city with 20,000 inhabitants. I personally don't like it because I think it combines the worst aspects of living in the countryside with the worst aspects living in the city. But it's an interesting, this is off the record, so cut it if you put this online. But it's an extremely interesting project. Also because 50% of the houses built there were off the market, were social housing, affordable housing, with this kind of rents, with highest building quality. So, and actually through zoning, there was also a high investment in greening in newly built areas. So they try to balance, they are, of course, in Vienna, they're obsessed with the housing sector, with good reasons, I would say. I think it's a unique case, but also with greening. And actually, the greening is an important part of investment. And one very important element is the proportion of land owned by the city. Because if you give to limited profit housing associations land owned by the city, the limited profit housing association is not able to guarantee you the right to buy. And that's an important element. So you are not putting this into home ownership model, which is put forward mainly by the Conservative Party. So the densification is taking place. It has a legacy from the Karl Marx of up to now, but The retrofitting, actually, here, it's not working so well as it should work. It's mainly through subsidies and housing subsidies rather than strict regulation. So you provide incentives, and these incentives help to change the situation. So the limited profit housing associations, energy performance is one of the criteria to award, so high quality. And you are not offloading the costs of retrofitting on the tenants. That's very important. That's actually one of the key elements in relating environmental and social targets. Because if you offload the costs, you increase inequality. If you are not able to offload the costs, you should have some compensatory measures which should somehow incentivize tenants to improve the energy performance of buildings. So there are tendencies in that. The problem is that the 2008 crisis decreased the pace of retrofitting. So usually it was 7,000 buildings per year of the old stock, and it halved after the crisis because the costs were rising, and they were prioritizing people in need. You might say, yes, but there will be long waiting lists for social housing because it's a fantastic system. It costs very little. You might have waiting lists. There are waiting lists, but the waiting lists are only if you are selecting specific areas or specific sizes of a flat where you would like to live. So if you say, I would like to live in the first district in a 100 square meter flat, you might wait for some time. But if you are in an emergency, in a few days, you get a flat, which is, I think, amazing. And I was extremely surprised. But the biggest challenge in environmental terms is the fact that we have almost half of a building, of a housing stock, which is powered by gas heating. And given the energy crisis, this exploded the costs. And this, of course, reduces the resources available to the city to put forward a retrofitting program. It didn't close down the program, but it slowed down substantially. But there are programs which are trying to intervene with the most extreme cases. So in synthesis, and this is my last slide, regulatory frameworks in Vienna urban institutions continue to play a strategic role in mitigating the repercussions of external crises and also of the environmental costs. Strong governmental intervention is in key policy areas, housing, labor market, green areas, etc., retain very important redistributive functions to protect the most vulnerable population, but also redistributing to middle classes. The autonomy acquired by the city as a consequence of decentralization processes enabled the city to complement and compensate for cuts taking place at the federal level. However, there are exclusionary tendencies involving non-EU migrants, young people, or income groups, but these are kept at a very small scale. So thank you very much for your attention.